He looked like any other taxi driver in the city. Same yellow cab, same worn leather jacket, same tired expression that came from working 16-hour shifts in traffic that never stopped. For 3 years, Mason Cole had driven the same routes through downtown Chicago, picking up businessmen who barely acknowledged his existence, tourists who treated him like part of the scenery, and college students who forgot his face before the ride was over. Nobody looked twice at the quiet driver with callous hands and eyes that seemed older than his 42 years. What they didn't know was that those hands had once defused bombs in Fallujah under enemy fire, that those eyes had identified targets from satellite imagery that saved entire cities from destruction, and that the man behind the wheel was someone the CIA had listed as missing in action after a classified mission went wrong 3 years ago. But when 5 armed terrorists walked into the federal building at 2:47 p.m., taking 200 hostages and demanding the release of their imprisoned leader, Mason Cole would have to decide whether to remain invisible forever or become the man he used to be one more time. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden identity, redemption, and the moment when a forgotten hero stepped out of the shadows to save hundreds of innocent lives, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that some people never stop serving their country, even when their country has forgotten they exist, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that legends often drive among us unrecognized, waiting for the moment when their skills become the difference between life and death. Chicago's morning rush hour moved with predictable chaos that defined urban life in America's third largest city. Mason Cole navigated his yellow cab through a familiar maze of Michigan Avenue, Lakeshore Drive, and the downtown streets that had become his entire world since disappearing from his previous life 3 years ago. The GPS on his dashboard showed 17 rides completed, $247 in fares collected, and 6 hours remaining on a shift that would end when exhaustion finally overcame his need to stay busy. Staying busy was important for Mason. It kept his mind occupied with immediate concerns, traffic patterns, customer destinations, fuel costs, rather than the memories that surfaced whenever silence allowed his thoughts to drift backward. Memories of briefing rooms in Langley, where he had analyzed satellite intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks across 3 continents. Memories of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where his expertise in explosive ordnance disposal had saved the lives of soldiers whose names he still remembered. Memories of the mission in Syria that had gone wrong in ways that forced him to disappear from his old life and assume the identity of someone who had never existed in government databases. The identity he had assumed was meticulously constructed but utterly ordinary. Mason Cole, 42 years old, divorced taxi driver with no criminal record, no military service, no government connections, and no reason for anyone to look beyond the surface details that established his legal existence. He paid his taxes, renewed his driver's license on schedule, and lived in a studio apartment in a neighborhood where anonymity was easy to maintain and questions were rarely asked. But maintaining his cover required more than just legal documentation. It required becoming someone whose capabilities never attracted attention, whose knowledge never revealed itself through casual conversation, whose instincts never suggested experiences that taxi drivers weren't supposed to have. For 3 years, Mason had practiced being ordinary, suppressing the training and expertise that had once made him one of the CIA's most valuable field operatives. The practice had become easier over time, but it had never become natural. When passengers discussed international news, Mason had to consciously avoid demonstrating knowledge of geopolitical situations he had personally influenced. When he observed suspicious behavior or unusual activity, he had to resist the analytical instincts that had once been crucial for survival in environments where failure to notice details meant death. When emergency vehicles passed with sirens wailing, he had to suppress the impulse to follow them toward situations where his skills might be needed. This morning's fares have been routine: airport runs, business meetings, medical appointments, and shopping trips that represented the normal flow of urban life. Mason had transported a pharmaceutical executive to a conference at the Marriott, a college student to O'Hare International, and an elderly woman to a doctor's appointment in Lincoln Park. Each ride had proceeded without incident. Conversation had remained superficial, and Mason had maintained the persona of someone whose life contained no secrets worth discovering. At 2:34 p.m., Mason received a dispatch that would change everything. Cab 47, pick up at Federal Building, 230 South Dearborn. Passenger going to Union Station. The federal building was a 30-story complex that housed multiple government agencies, including FBI field offices, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and various administrative departments that processed everything from passport applications to federal tax appeals. It was the kind of building that represented government presence in ways that most citizens rarely considered, but that would be symbolically significant to people who wanted to make statements about American power and authority. Mason had avoided the federal building during his 3 years as a taxi driver, not because it presented any direct threat to his cover identity, but because proximity to federal agencies created unnecessary exposure to people whose training might lead them to notice details that others would overlook. Federal agents were taught to observe and analyze human behavior in ways that could potentially identify someone whose background didn't match their current circumstances. But refusing the dispatch would create exactly the kind of anomaly that could attract unwanted attention. Taxi drivers who avoided certain locations without obvious reasons were the kind of irregular behavior that security agencies look for when identifying people who had something to hide. Mason acknowledged the dispatch and began driving toward downtown, calculating arrival time and planning the most direct route to minimize his exposure to federal security protocols. As he approached the federal building, Mason's training automatically assessed the security environment with the systematic attention that had kept him alive during operations in hostile territories. The building's defensive measures were visible but not excessive. Metal detectors at entrances, security guards at checkpoints, and surveillance cameras that monitored approaches and exits. Standard urban security for a federal facility, designed to deter casual threats rather than sophisticated attacks. What Mason noticed, but didn't consciously process until later, was the absence of certain security measures that should have been routine for a building housing sensitive federal operations. No perimeter barriers that would slow vehicle-borne attacks, no standoff distance that would protect against truck bombs, and no visible indicators of specialized counterterrorism capabilities that would be standard for facilities that process classified information or house high-value targets. The oversight was significant for someone with Mason's background in threat assessment and operational security. But as a taxi driver, he was supposed to notice only traffic patterns and passenger pickup locations, not the adequacy of federal security protocols. So he parked at the designated taxi zone and waited for his passenger, maintaining the professional disinterest that characterized experienced urban drivers. At 2:47 p.m., 5 men approached the federal building's main entrance with purposeful strides that immediately triggered Mason's tactical awareness. They moved with coordination that suggested prior planning, carried themselves with confidence that indicated specialized training, and positioned themselves with spacing that would allow mutual support if their approach was challenged by security personnel. Mason recognized the pattern from briefings about terrorist attack methodologies. Coordinated assault teams that use multiple operators to overwhelm defensive positions before security forces could respond effectively. But recognition was dangerous for someone maintaining deep cover as a civilian with no reason to understand tactical movement or threat assessment procedures. The men entered the federal building without apparent difficulty, which suggested either that security screening had failed to identify weapons and equipment that should have been detected, or that the attackers possessed credentials that allowed them to bypass normal security measures. Either possibility indicated a level of planning and preparation that exceeded casual criminal activity and suggested organized terrorism with capabilities that posed significant threats to everyone in the building. Mason's instinct was to follow the men into the building, where his expertise in counterterrorism operations could potentially neutralize the threat before innocent civilians were harmed. But following his instincts would require abandoning his cover identity and revealing capabilities that would make his continued anonymity impossible. The internal conflict lasted exactly 12 seconds, the time required for Mason to understand that hundreds of innocent people were about to become hostages or casualties, and that he was possibly the only person in the immediate area with the training and experience necessary to prevent a terrorist attack that could result in mass casualties. Mason switched off his taxi's engine, locked the vehicle, and began walking toward the federal building with the measured pace of someone whose experience had taught him that speed was less important than preparation, and that successful operations required patience rather than urgency. The federal building's main lobby was a study in bureaucratic efficiency. metal detectors, security checkpoints, information desks, and a constant flow of people who had business with various government agencies. At 2:47 p.m., the lobby contained approximately 60 people. Federal employees returning from lunch, visitors with scheduled appointments, and the usual mix of citizens who needed services that only government agencies could provide. Mason entered through the main entrance, passing through metal detectors that had been configured to detect weapons, but not the kind of improvised devices that could be constructed from materials available in any hardware store. His cover identity was supported by legitimate documentation that would pass casual inspection, and his appearance suggested nothing more threatening than a taxi driver who needed to use the building's public restrooms. But Mason's real purpose was reconnaissance, identifying the location and capabilities of the terrorist team that had entered the building, assessing their objectives and preparation, and determining whether intervention was possible without revealing his true identity and capabilities. The assessment required moving through the building with systematic attention to details that most people wouldn't notice. Unusual activity near security stations, changes in normal traffic patterns, and the subtle indicators that suggested coordinated hostile activity was occurring in areas not visible from the main lobby. Mason's training had taught him to identify terrorist operations through environmental cues rather than direct observation of hostile personnel. Terrorists who were properly prepared for building takeovers would avoid areas where their activities could be observed by casual visitors, but their presence would affect the behavior of building personnel in ways that could be detected by someone who understood what to look for. The first indication that something was wrong came from the behavior of security guards who were supposed to be monitoring visitor access, but who seemed distracted by something occurring in areas beyond Mason's. Observation. The second indication was the absence of normal elevator traffic to upper floors, suggesting that access to certain areas had been restricted or controlled. The third indication was the sound of gunfire from the building's upper levels. The shots were muffled by distance and building construction, but Mason's experience in combat zones allowed him to identify the specific acoustic signature of automatic weapons being fired in enclosed spaces. The pattern suggested coordinated assault rather than random violence. Multiple shooters engaging targets with precise timing and coordination that indicated professional military training. Mason's cover identity required him to react like a civilian who was hearing gunfire for the first time. Confusion, fear, and immediate impulse to evacuate the building along with other visitors who were beginning to understand that something dangerous was occurring in areas they couldn't see. But Mason's training required him to analyze the tactical situation and determine whether his intervention could prevent civilian casualties that would otherwise be inevitable. The gunfire pattern suggested that the terrorist team was securing specific areas of the building rather than conducting random attacks against civilians, which meant they had specific objectives that required controlling key locations while maintaining hostages who could be used for negotiation or propaganda purposes. The realization that this was a hostage situation rather than a mass shooting changed Mason's assessment of his options. Random violence required immediate intervention to prevent casualties, but hostage situations create opportunities for negotiation and tactical response that could minimize harm to innocent people if handled properly by law enforcement agencies with specialized training and equipment. Mason was in the process of evacuating with other civilians when the building's public address system activated with a message that changed everything about his understanding of the situation. Attention all personnel and visitors. This building is now under control of the Islamic Liberation Front. All floors above the third level are restricted areas. Anyone attempting to leave the building without authorization will be considered hostile and will be eliminated. We have taken 200 hostages and have placed explosive devices throughout the building that will detonate if our demands are not met within 6 hours. The announcement was delivered in accented English by someone whose voice carried the authority of leadership and the calm confidence that suggested extensive preparation for exactly the scenario. This wasn't random terrorism or opportunistic violence. This was a carefully planned operation designed to achieve specific political objectives through the systematic use of hostages and the threat of mass casualties. Mason understood immediately that law enforcement response to this situation would follow predictable patterns. Building perimeter control, hostage negotiation teams, tactical assessment, and the careful preparation of rescue operations that could take hours to develop and execute. During that time, 200 innocent people will remain under the control of terrorists whose willingness to kill civilians had already been demonstrated through their choice of tactics and targets. The question Mason faced was whether to maintain his cover identity and hope that law enforcement response would succeed without civilian casualties, or to risk everything he had built over 3 years by revealing his true capabilities and attempting to neutralize the terrorist threat before negotiation strategies could be attempted. The decision was made for him when a child began crying in the lobby, a sound that carried above the confused voices of adults who were trying to understand what was happening to them. Mason looked toward the sound and saw a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, separated from her parents by the chaos of evacuation procedures that had been interrupted by the terrorist announcement. Mason had seen children in war zones, had participated in operations designed to protect innocent civilians from violence they couldn't understand or escape. But this child was in Chicago, in a federal building that was supposed to be secure, cried because she was afraid and alone in a situation that adults had created through decisions she couldn't comprehend. The sight of the frightened child ended Mason's internal debate about maintaining his cover identity. Some responsibilities transcended personal security considerations, and protecting innocent people from terrorists was one of them. Mason approached the security guard, who was closest to the main entrance, identifying himself with words that would trigger immediate law enforcement response, while revealing capabilities that would end his anonymity forever. My name is Mason Cole. I'm former CIA operations, trained in counterterrorism and explosive ordnance disposal. I need to speak with whoever is coordinating response to this situation. The next 30 minutes transformed Mason from anonymous taxi driver to the focal point of a federal counterterrorism operation that would determine whether 200 hostages survive the next 6 hours. The FBI's hostage rescue team arrived within 20 minutes of the initial terrorist announcement, followed by equipment and personnel that represented the most advanced counterterrorism capabilities available to American law enforcement. Special Agent Sarah Chun, the HRT commander, briefed Mason on the situation while tactical teams established perimeter control and began reconnaissance operations designed to identify terrorist positions and hostage locations within the building. The intelligence picture that emerged was more complex and dangerous than the initial assessment had suggested. The terrorist team consists of 5 operators with military training and equipment that exceeds what we normally encounter in domestic operations, Agent Chin explained. They secured the building's upper floors and are holding approximately 200 hostages in conference rooms and office areas that they converted into improvised detention facilities. Mason studied building blueprints and security camera footage that revealed the scope of the terrorist operation. The attackers had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the building's layout, security systems, and the federal agencies housed in different areas. Their positioning suggested specific intelligence about high-value targets and classified operations that wouldn't be available to casual observers. What are their demands? Mason asked, analyzing the terrorist positions and identifying potential approach routes that could allow infiltration without alerting hostiles to rescue operations. Release of imprisoned associates, safe passage to a non-extradition country, and broadcast time for propaganda statements, Agent Chin replied. Standard terrorist negotiation positions, but their deadline is firm. 6 hours, or they begin executing hostages and detonating explosive devices they claim to have placed throughout the building. Mason's experience with terrorist psychology suggested that the deadline was real rather than negotiating tactic. The group's professionalism, their detailed preparation, and their willingness to take hundreds of hostages indicated commitment to their objectives that would make compromise unlikely if their demands weren't met. What's your tactical assessment for rescue operations? Mason asked, studying camera feeds that showed terrorist positions and the areas where hostages were being held. Conventional assault would result in significant civilian casualties, Agent Chin admitted. The terrorists have positioned themselves to maximize defensive advantages while ensuring that any rescue attempt would endanger the hostages they're using as human shields. Mason understood the tactical problem. The building's layout favored defenders who knew the terrain and had time to prepare, while the hostage locations made direct assault impossible without accepting casualty levels that law enforcement agencies couldn't justify. But Mason also understood that the situation offered opportunities that conventional law enforcement response couldn't exploit. His CIA training had included scenarios involving hostage rescue in urban environments, and his experience with explosive ordnance disposal provided capabilities that could neutralize terrorist advantages if applied properly. Agent Chun, I need to ask about the explosive devices the terrorists claim to have placed throughout the building. Have you confirmed their existence? Negative. Building security cameras don't show evidence of device placement, but the terrorists could have planted explosives during their initial infiltration or could be using devices that aren't visible through standard surveillance. Mason's expertise in explosive ordnance disposal allowed him to assess the terrorist claims about building-wide explosive devices. Based on their demonstrated capabilities and the time available for preparation, it was possible but unlikely that they had placed enough explosives to destroy the entire building. More probable was that they had positioned smaller devices at strategic locations that could cause significant casualties while creating the impression that the entire building was rigged for destruction. I can infiltrate the building and conduct reconnaissance that would identify explosive device locations while assessing opportunities for hostage rescue, Mason offered. My training includes both explosive ordnance disposal and close-quarters combat techniques that would allow me to operate independently without requiring backup that could compromise stealth operations. Agent Chin studied Mason with the professional assessment that marked experienced law enforcement personnel evaluating unknown capabilities. Mr. Cole, you're a taxi driver. Counterterrorism operations require specialized training and equipment that civilian volunteers don't possess. Mason reached into his jacket and produced documentation that he'd hoped never to use again. CIA credentials that identified him as a Level 5 operations specialist with counterterrorism clearances and field experience in hostile environments across 3 continents. Agent Chun, 3 years ago, I was a CIA operative who provided intelligent analysis for the disruption of terrorist networks in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. My cover was blown during an operation that went wrong, and I've been maintaining deep cover as a civilian while waiting for clearance to return to active operations. The credentials were authentic, but they also represented the end of Mason's anonymous existence as a Chicago taxi driver. By revealing his true identity and capabilities, he had committed himself to outcomes that would either validate his decision to break cover or result in consequences that would make his previous 3 years of careful preparation meaningless. Agent Chin examined Mason's credentials with growing understanding of the resources that had unexpectedly become available for the hostage rescue operation. Mr. Cole, if your background is authentic, you represent capabilities that could change our tactical options significantly. My background is authentic, and I'm volunteering for insertion operations that conventional law enforcement can't attempt without accepting casualty levels that make rescue operations inadvisable. The decision to accept Mason's offer required authorization from federal officials who had to balance the potential benefits of his expertise against the risks of deploying someone whose operational status was uncertain and whose motivations might include personal considerations that could compromise mission effectiveness. But with 200 hostages and a 6-hour deadline, conventional tactical options were limited to negotiation strategies that might not succeed and assault operations that would probably result in significant civilian casualties. After consultations that lasted 20 minutes and involved officials whose security clearances allowed them to verify Mason's CIA background, Agent Chin received authorization to incorporate Mason into the hostage rescue operation as a specialized consultant whose expertise would be used for reconnaissance and explosive ordnance disposal tasks that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. Mr. Cole, you're authorized for limited infiltration operations designed to assess terrorist capabilities and identify opportunities for hostage rescue. But you're operating under FBI command authority, and any tactical actions require coordination with our teams. Mason understood that the authorization represented compromise between his capabilities and law enforcement protocols that couldn't accommodate completely independent operations. But it also provided him with official sanction for actions that would have been illegal if attempted without proper authority. Understood, Agent Chun. I'll need building blueprints, current intelligence on terrorist positions, and communications equipment that will allow coordination with your tactical teams. The preparation for Mason's infiltration required adapting FBI equipment and procedures for operations that exceeded normal law enforcement scenarios. His insertion would be conducted through building areas that weren't under terrorist control, but which provided access to upper floors where hostages were being held, and where explosive devices might have been placed. At Mason's infiltration of the federal building began at 4:23 p.m. through maintenance areas that provided access to the building's mechanical systems and service corridors. The route had been selected to avoid terrorist observation while allowing movement to areas where reconnaissance could identify hostage locations and assess the terrorist claims about explosive devices throughout the building. Moving through the building service areas required navigating spaces that were designed for maintenance personnel rather than tactical operations. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, and mechanical equipment created obstacles that slowed movement while generating noise that could alert terrorists to unauthorized activity in areas they might not be directly monitoring, but which they would investigate if suspicious sounds suggested security breaches. Mason's progress was methodical rather than rapid, with each movement calculated to minimize sound while maintaining communication with FBI tactical teams who were monitoring his infiltration through building security cameras and radio communications that use encrypted frequencies to prevent terrorist interception. The first area Mason reached was the building's fourth floor, where intelligence suggested that approximately 50 hostages were being held in conference rooms that had been converted into improvised detention facilities. The area was under terrorist control, but Mason's approach through service corridors allowed him to observe hostage conditions without alerting hostile personnel to his presence. Through ventilation grates that provided visual access to terrorist-controlled areas, Mason could observe that the hostages appeared to be unharmed, but were clearly under stress from confinement conditions and the knowledge that their lives depended on negotiations they couldn't influence. The terrorists guarding them were positioned to prevent escape attempts while maintaining sightlines that would allow them to respond to rescue operations. But Mason also observed details that conventional surveillance couldn't detect: the specific weapons and equipment being used by terrorist personnel, their communication procedures and coordination patterns, and most importantly, evidence of explosive devices that had been placed at strategic locations throughout the areas under their control. "Agent Chun, this is Cole," Mason whispered into his communications equipment. "I have visual confirmation of hostages on the fourth floor. Approximately 50 individuals, apparently unharmed, guarded by 2 terrorists with automatic weapons. I also have confirmation of explosive devices positioned at entry points that would detonate if conventional assault operations were attempted." The intelligence provided tactical options that FBI planners could use to develop rescue operations, but also confirmed that terrorist claims about explosive devices were accurate rather than bluffing tactics designed to discourage law enforcement response. Mason's reconnaissance continued to the building's 5th and 6th floors, where additional hostages were being held under similar conditions. The pattern that emerged suggested systematic organization rather than improvised terrorism. The hostages had been separated into groups that could be managed by individual terrorist operatives, while explosive devices had been positioned to maximize casualties if rescue operations were attempted without specialized techniques for dealing with improvised explosive devices. But Mason's expertise in explosive ordnance disposal allowed him to identify characteristics of the devices that suggested they could be neutralized by someone with appropriate training and equipment. The explosives appear to be military-grade materials that have been configured for maximum psychological impact rather than optimal destructive efficiency, which meant they represented serious threats that could be managed if approached properly. "Agent Chun, I'm observing consistent patterns in device placement and configuration that suggest they can be neutralized systematically if approached with proper EOD procedures," Mason reported. But the neutralization would require direct access to device locations, which means hostage areas would have to be secure before explosive ordnance disposal operations could be conducted safely. The intelligence Mason was providing created tactical options that hadn't existed before his infiltration, but implementing those options would require coordination between hostage rescue operations and explosive ordnance disposal procedures that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. At 5:15 p.m., Mason's reconnaissance was interrupted by terrorist activity that suggested preparation for actions that could result in immediate casualties. Through his observation position, he could see terrorists moving with urgency that indicated response to external pressures or internal timeline considerations that were accelerating their operational schedule. Agent Chun, terrorist activity is increasing in ways that suggest they may be preparing to execute hostages or detonate explosive devices ahead of their stated deadline, Mason reported. I recommend immediate tactical intervention before they can implement whatever actions they're preparing. The response from FBI command indicated that negotiation efforts had reached impasse and that terrorist leadership was becoming increasingly agitated by law enforcement response that didn't appear to be moving toward acceptance of their demands. Cole, we're seeing similar indicators from our external observation. The terrorist leadership is demanding immediate compliance with their demands and is threatening to begin executing hostages if they don't receive confirmation of prisoner releases within the next hour. Mason understood that the situation was approaching crisis point where continued reconnaissance would become less valuable than direct action to prevent civilian casualties. His position within the building provided opportunities for a tactical intervention that external law enforcement couldn't attempt. But such intervention would require revealing his presence to terrorists who would then modify their tactics to counter threats they hadn't previously considered. Agent Chen, I'm in position to neutralize terrorist threats on the 4th floor if you can coordinate simultaneous operations on other floors. But once I begin tactical operations, the terrorists will know that law enforcement has personnel inside the building, and they'll modify their procedures accordingly. The decision to authorize Mason's direct intervention required accepting that negotiations had failed and that hostage rescue operations represented the only remaining option for preventing mass casualties. But it also required trusting that Mason's capabilities were sufficient for independent operations in hostile territory without backup that could respond immediately if his intervention encountered problems. Cole, you're authorized for tactical intervention. We'll coordinate simultaneous operations on all floors where hostages are being held. Execute on my command. Mason prepared for the transition from reconnaissance to direct action, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether 200 innocent people survive the day and whether his decision to break cover will be validated by successful operations or render meaningless by failure to prevent the casualties he was trying to avoid. The assault phase of the hostage rescue operation began at 5:34 p.m. with coordinated attacks designed to neutralize terrorist threats before they could harm hostages or detonate explosive devices. Mason's role was to secure the 4th floor while FBI tactical teams engaged terrorists on other floors, creating simultaneous pressure that would prevent coordinated terrorist response to the rescue operations. Mason's approach to the 4th floor terrorists required movement from concealed observation positions to close-quarters combat range without alerting hostile personnel to his presence. The transition demanded skills that combined stealth infiltration with combat techniques, capabilities that Mason had developed through CIA training but hadn't used operationally for 3 years. The first terrorist was neutralized through techniques that ensured no alarm could be raised to alert other hostile personnel. Mason's approach was silent and efficient, eliminating the threat while securing weapons and communication equipment that could be used to monitor terrorist coordination on other floors. The second terrorist presented more complex challenges due to his position relative to hostages, who could be harmed if combat operations weren't executed with precision that prevented collateral damage. Mason's solution required close-quarters combat techniques that neutralized the threat while ensuring that hostages weren't endangered by gunfire or explosive devices that could be triggered by dying terrorists. 4th floor secure, Mason reported to FBI command. 2 terrorists neutralized, approximately 50 hostages secured, beginning explosive ordnance disposal operations. The explosive devices that Mason had identified during his reconnaissance required systematic neutralization procedures that ensured they couldn't be detonated remotely by terrorist personnel who might retain control capabilities even after their on-site operatives had been eliminated. The devices were sophisticated enough to require careful handling, but they followed design patterns that Mason recognized from his military and CIA experience. Each device was configured with multiple firing systems that provided redundancy in case primary detonation methods failed, but the same redundancy created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with appropriate training in explosive ordnance disposal procedures. Mason's work on the explosive devices required tools and techniques that exceeded what was available through normal law enforcement response. But his CIA background had included training in improvised explosive device neutralization using materials that could be obtained from building maintenance facilities and emergency response equipment. Agent Chun, fourth-floor explosive devices neutralized. Hostages are secure and ready for evacuation when other floors are cleared. The reports from FBI tactical teams indicated successful operations on the 5th and 6th floors, with all terrorist personnel neutralized and remaining hostages secured without casualties. But the building's explosive devices required systematic clearance before evacuation could be conducted safely, and that clearance would require Mason's expertise applied to areas throughout the facility. The explosive ordnance disposal phase of the operation took 47 minutes and involved neutralizing 12 separate devices that had been positioned to maximize psychological impact while providing terrorist leadership with multiple options for causing mass casualties if their demands weren't met. Mason's work on the devices revealed sophisticated understanding of explosive techniques and federal building vulnerabilities that suggested the terrorist operation had been planned with intelligence that exceeded what was available through public sources. The device placement and configuration indicated knowledge of building systems and structural weaknesses that would have required extensive reconnaissance or inside information about federal security procedures. But the devices also revealed limitations in terrorist capabilities that had allowed Mason to neutralize them without the specialized equipment that would normally be required for such operations. The terrorists had prioritized psychological impact over technical sophistication, creating threats that were dangerous but manageable for someone with appropriate training and experience. At 6:47 p.m., exactly 4 hours after the terrorist announcement that had initiated the crisis, Mason reported completion of explosive ordnance disposal operations throughout the federal building. All hostile personnel had been neutralized, all hostages had been secured without casualties, and all explosive devices had been rendered safe for normal building evacuation procedures. Agent Chun, building is clear. All explosive devices neutralized, all hostages secure. Recommend immediate evacuation and medical assessment for civilians who have been under stress for extended periods. The evacuation of 200 hostages required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, medical personnel, and building management systems that had been disrupted by terrorist operations. But the evacuation proceeded without incident, with hostages receiving medical attention and debriefing procedures that would help them process experiences that most civilians never have to endure. Mason's role in the operation officially ended with the completion of explosive ordnance disposal procedures, but his presence at the scene created complications that required resolution before normal law enforcement activities could resume. His CIA credentials were authentic, but his operational status remained uncertain, and his 3 years of deep cover as a Chicago taxi driver had created documentation inconsistencies that required clarification through channels that exceeded normal FBI administrative procedures. Mr. Cole, your performance during this operation was exceptional, and your capabilities were critical for the successful rescue of all hostages without casualties, Agent Chin acknowledged. But your status requires resolution through federal agencies that have jurisdiction over CIA personnel and classified operations. Mason understood that revealing his identity and capabilities had ended his anonymous existence as a Chicago taxi driver, but it also opened possibilities for returning to the kind of work that had defined his professional identity before circumstances had forced him into deep cover. The debriefing procedures that followed would determine whether Mason's operational capabilities could be restored through appropriate federal agencies, or whether his unauthorized break from deep cover would result in consequences that made his previous 3 years of careful preparation meaningless. But regardless of bureaucratic outcomes, Mason had accomplished what he had set out to do. 200 innocent people had survived a terrorist attack because someone with appropriate training and experience had been willing to risk everything to prevent mass casualties. 6 months after the federal building hostage crisis, Mason Cole found himself in a situation he had never expected. Testifying before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee about classified operations, deep cover protocols, and the circumstances that had led him to break cover during a domestic terrorist incident, The testimony was conducted in a secure facility where senators with appropriate security clearances could receive briefings about CIA operations without compromising ongoing intelligence activities. Mason's case had attracted attention from officials who were responsible for oversight of intelligence operations and who needed to understand how a missing CIA operative had spent 3 years working as a taxi driver in Chicago without detection by federal agencies that were supposed to track personnel with classified backgrounds. Mr. Cole, Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, began the questioning. Please explain to committee how you transitioned from CIA operations to civilian employment without maintaining contact with your parent agency. Mason's response required explaining circumstances that involved classified operations whose details couldn't be discussed in detail even in secure congressional briefings. Senator Williams, the mission that resulted in my disappearance from CIA records involved intelligence gathering in Syria that was compromised by hostile forces. My extraction from the operational area required assuming an identity that couldn't be connected to U.S. intelligence operations, and maintaining that identity required severing contact with CIA personnel until circumstances allowed safe reintegration. Mason's answer reflected understanding of both operational security requirements and the bureaucratic realities that govern intelligence operations. Senator Williams, I recommend that intelligence agencies develop protocols for personnel who are forced to assume deep cover identities due to operational circumstances beyond their control. Such protocols should include secure communication methods that allow periodic contact without compromising cover identities, and procedures for reintegration when operational circumstances permit return to active status. The committee's final recommendations included commendations for Mason's actions during the hostage crisis, but also called for improved CIA protocols for tracking personnel who were operating under deep cover identities, and for better coordination between intelligence agencies and law enforcement organizations during domestic incidents that involved personnel with classified backgrounds. Mason's operational status was restored with assignment to a specialized unit that handled domestic counterterrorism operations, where his experience with both intelligence analysis and tactical operations could be applied to threats that required capabilities exceeding normal law enforcement response. But Mason's return to active operations also included acknowledgement that his 3 years as a Chicago taxi driver had provided him with perspectives on civilian life and domestic security, challenges that enhanced his effectiveness as an intelligence operative. His experience living anonymously among the people he was trained to protect had deepened his understanding of the stakes involved in counterterrorism operations and the importance of protecting innocent civilians from threats they couldn't identify or counter on their own. The taxi cab that Mason had driven for 3 years was returned to Fleet, where it resumed normal service under a different driver. But the vehicle had been equipped with surveillance and communication systems that had allowed Mason to maintain situational awareness of potential security threats throughout Chicago, capabilities that had been developed during his deep cover assignment, and which had contributed to his ability to respond effectively when the federal building crisis occurred. Mason's apartment in the anonymous neighborhood where he lived for 3 years was maintained as a safe house for other intelligence operatives who might require deep cover identities for extended periods. The location had proven effective for maintaining anonymity while providing access to the kind of normal civilian activities that were necessary for establishing and maintaining cover identities that could withstand casual investigation. But Mason's most significant contribution to intelligence operations was the development of protocols that incorporated lessons learned from his unauthorized deep cover assignment. His experience had demonstrated that intelligence operatives could maintain operational effectiveness while living completely anonymous civilian lives, and that such assignments could actually enhance their capabilities by providing first-hand understanding of the civilian populations they were trained to protect. The protocols Mason developed were classified and distributed only to personnel with appropriate security clearances, but they influence how intelligence agencies approach long-term cover assignments and domestic operations that required operatives to blend seamlessly into civilian populations while maintaining readiness for immediate activation when threats emerged. 2 years after the federal building incident, Mason was assigned to a case that would test everything he had learned about balancing civilian identity with operational responsibilities. Intelligence sources had identified a terrorist cell operating in Detroit that was planning attacks against multiple targets throughout the Midwest, using local recruitment and indigenous support that made them nearly impossible to detect through conventional surveillance methods. Mason's assignment was to establish deep cover in Detroit's urban transportation network, using his experience as a taxi driver to develop the kind of street-level intelligence that could identify terrorist activities that remain invisible to satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence gathering methods. The assignment required Mason to once again assume the identity of someone whose background contained no government connections, no military service, and no reason for anyone to suspect that he possessed capabilities beyond those of an ordinary civilian trying to make a living in an economically challenged urban environment. But this time, Mason's deep cover assignment was conducted with full agency support and regular communication protocols that ensured his activities were coordinated with ongoing intelligence operations while maintaining the anonymity that was essential for infiltrating communities where terrorist recruitment was occurring. Mason's work in Detroit revealed the extent to which domestic terrorist threats had evolved since the federal building incident. The cell he was investigating used sophisticated recruitment techniques that targeted individuals whose personal circumstances made them vulnerable to radicalization, while employing operational security measures that exceeded what intelligence agencies had encountered in previous domestic investigations. The terrorists had learned from the failures of previous operations, developing methods that avoided the kind of electronic communications and financial transactions that could be monitored through conventional intelligence collection methods. Instead, they relied on personal relationships, cash transactions, and communication methods that required human intelligence rather than technical surveillance to detect and counter. Mason's position as a taxi driver provided access to exactly the kind of human intelligence that was needed to understand how the terrorist network operated and recruited new members. His passengers included people whose conversations revealed economic frustrations, political grievances, and social isolation that made them potential targets for terrorist recruitment efforts. But Mason's role also required him to identify and assess these potential recruits without revealing his own capabilities or creating suspicions that could compromise his cover identity. The work demanded skills that combined intelligent analysis with acting abilities, requiring him to appear genuinely sympathetic to grievances and frustrations while secretly evaluating threats and opportunities for counterterrorism intervention. The investigation lasted 8 months and resulted in the disruption of terrorist operations that would have targeted shopping centers, transportation hubs, and government facilities throughout Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. The intelligence Mason provided led to arrests of 12 terrorist operatives and the seizure of weapons and explosives that would have caused hundreds of casualties if the planned attacks had been executed. But Mason's success in Detroit also demonstrated the psychological costs of extended deep cover operations. Living anonymously while constantly evaluating potential threats created stress that exceeded what was experienced during conventional intelligence operations, and maintaining cover identities while conducting counterterrorism investigations required emotional discipline that tested the limits of human endurance. The debriefing procedures that followed Mason's Detroit assignment included psychological evaluation and support services that addressed the unique challenges faced by intelligence. Operatives who conducted extended deep cover operations in domestic environments. The evaluation revealed that Mason's experience as a Chicago taxi driver had prepared him for the psychological demands of long-term anonymity, but that extended operations required additional support systems to maintain operational effectiveness while protecting mental health. 5 years after the federal building hostage crisis, Mason Cole had become one of the CIA's most valuable specialists in domestic counterterrorism operations that required deep cover infiltration of civilian populations. His experience living anonymously as a taxi driver had evolved into systematic expertise in maintaining cover identities while conducting intelligence operations in urban environments where terrorist recruitment and operational planning occurred among populations that were largely invisible to conventional surveillance methods. Mason's assignments had taken him to cities throughout the United States, where he had worked as a taxi driver, delivery truck operator, maintenance worker, and various other occupations that provided access to communities where terrorist activities could be identified and countered through human intelligence rather than technical surveillance. Each assignment had contributed to Mason's understanding of domestic terrorism threats and the methods required to counter them effectively. But the assignments had also reinforced his appreciation for the civilian populations he was trained to protect, and his understanding of the social and economic conditions that could make ordinary people vulnerable to terrorist recruitment efforts. Mason's work had prevented dozens of terrorist attacks that would have caused hundreds of casualties among innocent civilians who had no knowledge of the threats they faced or the intelligence operations that protected them from violence they couldn't anticipate or prevent. But Mason's contributions to domestic security extended beyond individual counterterrorism operations. His experience had demonstrated that effective intelligence work in domestic environments required understanding civilian populations not as abstract targets to be protected, but as real people whose lives, concerns, and vulnerabilities had to be understood in order to identify and counter threats that emerged from within their communities. The protocols Mason had developed for deep cover operations were being taught to intelligence operatives throughout the CIA, FBI, and other agencies whose missions required infiltration of civilian populations for counterterrorism purposes. His methods had proven effective for gathering intelligence that couldn't be obtained through technical surveillance, while maintaining operational security that protected both operatives and innocent civilians from exposure to hostile forces. Mason's expertise had also contributed to training programs that prepared law enforcement personnel for counterterrorism operations in urban environments where terrorist activities were concealed within normal civilian activities. His experience had shown that effective counterterrorism required understanding not just terrorist tactics and capabilities, but the civilian context within which those tactics were employed and the community relationships that could either facilitate or hinder terrorist operations. The federal building hostage crisis that had ended Mason's anonymous existence as a Chicago taxi driver had become a case study in intelligence training programs, but not for the tactical operations that had rescued 200 hostages. Instead, the case was studied for what it revealed about the value of deep cover operations and the importance of maintaining intelligence capabilities that could respond immediately when domestic threats emerged in locations and circumstances that exceeded the response time of conventional law enforcement. Mason's decision to break cover during the hostage crisis had saved 200 innocent lives, but it also demonstrated that domestic security depended on intelligence operatives who were willing to live anonymously among civilian populations while maintaining readiness for immediate activation when their specialized capabilities became necessary for protecting people who had no knowledge of the threats they faced. On the 10th anniversary of the federal building incident, Mason Cole attended a classified ceremony at CIA headquarters where he received recognition for contributions to domestic counterterrorism operations that had prevented attacks causing an estimated 2,000 civilian casualties over the course of his post-incident career. The ceremony was attended by officials whose security clearances allowed them to understand the scope of Mason's contributions to national security, but the specific details of his operations remained classified to protect ongoing intelligence activities and the identities of personnel who continued to conduct similar operations in locations where discovery would result in immediate danger. CIA Director Patricia Hayes presented Mason with recognition that acknowledged both his tactical performance during the federal building crisis and his subsequent contributions to the development of domestic counterterrorism capabilities that had enhanced national security in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged or understood. Agent Cole, your willingness to sacrifice personal anonymity for protection of innocent civilians exemplifies a dedication to service that defines intelligence operations at their best, Director Hayes said during the presentation. Your subsequent contributions to domestic counterterrorism capabilities have enhanced our ability to identify and counter threats before they can harm the people we are sworn to protect. Mason's response reflected the perspective he had developed through years of living anonymously among the civilian populations he was trained to protect. Director Hayes, the most important recognition for intelligence work comes not from ceremonies or official acknowledgement, but from a knowledge that innocent people continue to live normal lives because threats against them have been identified and neutralized before they could cause harm. The classified nature of Mason's work meant that his contributions would never be publicly recognized or understood, but his influence on domestic counterterrorism operations would continue through the operatives he had trained, the protocols he had developed, and the successful operations that his methods had made possible. Mason's career had demonstrated that effective intelligence work required not just technical capabilities and operational training, but genuine understanding of and commitment to civilian populations whose security depended on intelligence operations they would never know about, and whose success they would never be able to acknowledge or appreciate. After the ceremony, Mason returned to his current assignment, maintaining deep cover as a mechanic in a small town in Montana, where intelligence sources had identified activities that might indicate terrorist recruitment efforts targeting veterans whose military experience could be exploited for domestic attacks against government facilities. The assignment required Mason to once again assume the identity of someone whose background contained no government connections and no reason for anyone to suspect that he possessed capabilities beyond those needed for automotive repair work. But the assignment also allowed him to continue the work that had defined his professional identity since the day he had decided to break cover in a Chicago taxicab and reveal himself as someone whose training and experience could prevent mass casualties among innocent civilians. Mason's taxi driving days were over, but his commitment to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves continued through work that remained invisible to the populations it served and unacknowledged by the people whose lives it preserved. In a world where security threats evolved constantly and where terrorists adapted their methods to counter conventional law enforcement and intelligence capabilities, Mason Cole represented the kind of intelligence operative whose dedication to service transcended personal considerations and whose effectiveness depended on his willingness to live anonymously among the people he was trained to protect. His story reminded intelligence professionals that the most important work was often the most invisible, that the most effective operatives were often the most anonymous, and that true service to country was measured not by recognition or acknowledgement, but by the simple knowledge that innocent people continue to live safe lives because someone had been willing to sacrifice personal comfort and identity for their protection. Some heroes announce themselves with dramatic actions that earn public recognition and historical remembrance. Others work quietly in the shadows, protecting people who will never know their names or understand the risks that were accepted on their behalf. Mason Cole belonged to the second category, a reminder that the most important victories in the struggle for security and freedom are often achieved by people whose contributions remain classified, whose identities remain secret, and whose dedication to service continues regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates the sacrifice involved in protecting innocent people from threats they never see coming. The yellow taxi cab that Mason had driven through Chicago streets for 3 years had been replaced by a mechanic's coveralls in a small Montana town, but the mission remained the same, staying close to the people who needed protection while maintaining the capabilities required to neutralize threats before they could cause harm to innocent civilians who depended on intelligence operatives they would never meet to keep them safe from dangers they would never understand.